Dustin Keating wants to know, why does a four-stroke hold their value, but a two-stroke doesn't? Because if you take an '08 Yamaha four-stroke and a 2008 Yamaha two-stroke with the same amount of hours, you think the two-stroke would be more reliable, or well, I think he means valuable. Welcome to the Boaters Podcast, a podcast all about boating and outboards. If you are new here, just like Dustin, make sure you like, comment, and subscribe to be a part of this conversation. We are totally funded by the viewer, so thank you all of you who have bought merch like the t-shirts and the fishing shirts from our store at bornagainboatingshop.com or are a part of the Boaters program. We have also got a school community now, so if you would like to get into contact with me and have more of a one-on-one discussion and stuff like that, make sure you check out the links in the description below and join the school community. Now, as far as Dustin's comment goes on why they hold their value more, I think the value totally comes with the perception and what's more readily available. So depending on where you live is going to also determine the value of something. So if you're in an area where most everybody already has a four-stroke, granted that four-strokes have been out for over 20 years now. So the majority in highly populated areas like Southwest Florida and all of Florida really, and then Texas, Alabama, any of these areas where you are closer to the ocean and you have a heavy amount of boats with outboards, I would say the four-stroke market has anywhere from 60 to 70%, if not more, of the boats out there are now running four-strokes. If you live in the north, it might be a little bit different of a scenario. You might still have more closer to a 50-50, 60-40 of two-stroke versus four-stroke, like that are actually on the back of boats, compared to an area like where I live in Florida. The vast majority of people nowadays are running four-strokes. Now, when it comes to having an engine that you need to replace, that's where the value comes in, because you're trying to sell something that someone else needs. So if you have let's say you've got a 2008 four-stroke on the back of your boat, you don't want to purchase a 2008 two-stroke because it's going to totally change everything. You're not set up with the oil tanks. You are used to the four-stroke, the quietness, the fuel economy, and all that other stuff. So I think there's a lot more people out there that when it comes to replace an engine, or people that are trying to upgrade their engines, like let's say you're running a 1990 two-stroke on the back of your boat and it finally kicks the bucket. When that thing finally kicks the bucket, you might be wanting to upgrade to the four-stroke for the fuel economy and for the quietness and the other aspects of owning a four-stroke over a two-stroke. And so you're more willing to upgrade at that time to a four-stroke rather than just remove and replace. Granted, there's still a lot of people out there, that would just remove and replace. Like on that 17 Key West that has a 92 stroke on it, if that thing kicks the bucket, I'd be looking for a 92 stroke. I'd want the same thing that I had before. So, in that aspect, they still hold their value, but you can still get a 150 for a couple grand. So it all depends on where you're at and what exactly you have. Also the condition. There's a lot of people that are looking at two strokes, and when it comes to repowering their boat or getting a boat running, they look at a two stroke and you're looking at a 20, 30, 40-year-old engine. So a lot of people just have that perception that why would I buy something that's 40 years old, 30 years old, rather than buy something that's 10 to 15 years old. And there's not a lot of two strokes that were made 10, 15 years ago outside of like the Optimax. The HPDI and other two-strokes in the United States. If you live anywhere else in the world, you can go to the Yamaha shop and buy a brand new Enduro, which is going to last you 40 years. So, as far as a reliability conversation goes, that's a totally different conversation. But as far as the value goes and why people are willing to pay more, if someone's willing to pay more, that drives the price of something up. If you got a 2008 four-stroke and you got a 2008 two-stroke and you got 10 people that want the four-stroke and 2 people that want the two-stroke, the people that are all fighting for that four-stroke are going to pay more to get it, opposed to the 2 people that you got looking at your two-stroke. So that plays a big factor in there as well. So trying to think if there's anything else off the top of my head on why the value of four-stroke would be more. Obviously it's more expensive. There's more parts to it. And, all in around the engine is a lot more complicated as far as the sensors that are on it and the stuff that goes into a four-stroke. A four-stroke is going to be it's going to cost more than a two-stroke in general because it has more parts to it. It has more features to it. It has more going on, which I mean, if you compare like an Optimax or an HPDI or an E-Tech, they're pretty advanced. There's a lot going on with those engines, so I'm not saying it in that aspect, but I'm saying in the fact that in general to produce a 4-stroke is generally more than it was to produce a 2-stroke, and so many companies don't sell 2-strokes in the United States anymore. So therefore, I don't think I have anything else as far as on that topic, because I think that basically covers it. There's not really any other kind of hidden thing that makes a 4-stroke more valuable. When it comes to reliable, the 2-stroke is just as reliable as the 4-stroke, depending on the condition. In all honesty, the reliability conversation, we've had this conversation a lot. There's got a whole video dedicated to this, so I'm not going to beat the reliability thing of a 2-stroke versus a 4-stroke, because they're both reliable. It all comes down to maintenance and how the engine was taken care of. Because if you have a well-maintained 2-stroke that was run in fresh water, it is going to be just as reliable as a well-maintained 4-stroke that is used in saltwater or freshwater. It doesn't matter. It's a well-maintained engine is going to be more reliable than a clapped-out engine that has not been well-maintained. If you just run your engine in saltwater, you don't flush it, you don't do services on the intervals, you're running, 300 hours in between oil changes and all this other stuff, then that engine is going to be way less reliable and more susceptible to breaking, because it has just been abused and it's just wearing itself out compared to the lightly used or well-maintained engine. So the reliability conversation is they're both reliable depending on who took care of it. There's not much more about that conversation other than that. Like I said, 40-year-old 2-stroke in the middle of Wisconsin running crystal clean, snow melted fresh water, they're still running them today. So there's no saying that it's not reliable. But you take that same engine and you don't service it and you run it in, Key Largo for 10 years, thing's going to look all trashed out and it's going to be all clogged up. The cooling passages are going to clog up, which means it's going to run hotter. When it runs hotter, the heat will warp things. You're going to have more friction. You've got just more problems in general because it's not maintained, and you have cooling issues, heating issues. Then your rings start to fail. You lose compression. You got carbon buildup. Like, all kinds of things happen because of a non-maintenance, and depending on the environment that you run in, that makes it unreliable. So I don't think that we can really have the conversation of the 2-stroke being more reliable than the 4-stroke with the same amount of hours if you don't talk about the environment and the maintenance of the engine. So that's all I got on that one. Corey Johansson says, any tips on picking out the correct fuse for a bilge pump? I'm new. Yeah, look at the bilge pump. Most bilge pumps are going to have a thing on the top of them that tell you the rated amperage of it. So you're just going to have a fuse there. By and large, most bilge pumps take a 10 amp fuse. So, save you the time there. But some of the more bigger ones might take a 15. And some of the smaller ones might take like a 7.5. Totally dependent, but by and large, most of them are a 10 amp fuse. And this goes for any kind of electronics. Since you're new and talking about picking a correct fuse for your electronics, you need to look at your electronics, and they all are going to have a rating. And you don't need to, like, if you don't have the box or any of the stuff, that's fine too. Just look at whatever you're looking at, like your radio, your VHF, doesn't matter what it is, just look at the item. It's going to say a brand. It's going to say, Simrad, Fruno, Garmin, whatever. It's going to say a brand on it and probably have a model number. If you don't see the model number, look at the back of it, and on the back of it, you're going to have a model number. Go to Google and look up that brand name, that model number component, and specifications. When you look at the specifications list, it's going to give you a rated amperage, or a fuse protection, and that's what's going to tell you what fuse to use to protect that circuit. Going above and beyond that, when we're talking about, the wire gauge and all that other stuff, that's a totally different subject because of distance the electronic is from the power source and how many items are on that circuit. So, like, say your electronics, your house battery is in the console and you're running a VHF, a chart plotter, and a stereo with 4 speakers, no amp. The distance from the battery to the fuse panel and then the 4 items that go out to power those 4 items, not very much. You're only going to need a 6-gauge wire would most likely be enough to carry the amperage from the battery to the fuse block, and then from the fuse block to each one of those components. Each one of those components might only need, a 10 amp fuse to protect them. and the power that they consume, you might only need like a 12 or a 14 gauge, not a 12, but like a 14 gauge or a 16 gauge wire in order to power them. Then if you take that battery, you put it in the back of the boat, and now it's 25 feet away, and your fuse panel's over here, and the items are upstairs, and you've got now a 40, 50 foot distance between the battery, the fuse panel, and those components. Now that amperage or the wire gauge needs to be stepped up in order to supply enough amperage to power that component without it having issues or prematurely failing because it wasn't getting the proper amount of power. MMA Guy says, trying to start my boat for the season. I put the earmuffs on and I got no water coming out, but I only waited like 10 seconds. Should I wait longer? I don't want to overheat the engine, so I shut it off. Yeah, 10 seconds might not be enough, but then at the same time, depending on the engine, the water pressure that you have there, your hose pressure, well pressure, whatever you got, and then the volume, some engines aren't going to have a telltale when you run them on the muffs. Definitely don't be revving the engine up. And then number two, yeah, wait like 10, 15 seconds, 20 seconds to see if it starts to come out. If it doesn't, it's most likely the back pressure. So I guess the best way to describe this is that an impeller is more creating pressure and not so much creating vacuum. It is creating vacuum, but just go with me on this line of thinking. Think about your impeller as creating pressure and not really vacuum. You put your earmuffs down here on the lower unit and your impeller is right here, right? The impeller is above the water. The water has pressure. It's pushing it in. It's pushing some water up to the impeller, but maybe it's not getting all that much. So the impeller starts to spin, and it's not really getting much water to push up into the engine. Whereas you take the same thing and you stick it down into water, like say you get a bucket and you put the bucket around the lower unit, or you just put your boat in the water, that lower unit is now under the water and your impeller is here, where the water is up to here. So now your impeller is completely submerged in the water. With it completely submerged, now all of a sudden making pressure is totally easy because it's primed up, I guess you'd say. You're primed up because it's under the water. That is going to move water instantly, and it's going to have the correct volume of water because it's, pressurized with the water above it and the impeller here and water being fed from the bottom. It is pressurized or primed up, which means that it's just have a constant flow, so it builds enough pressure to fill the power head with water and then run out the telltale, run out the exhaust, cool the engine, all that good stuff. But on the muffs, sometimes that situation doesn't happen and they don't pee. If you turn it on and you don't see water coming out the exhaust, that's an issue because it's not cooling the engine. So yeah, you're going to burn up the impeller if you run it for 30, 60, 2 minutes. So definitely about that. I guess that's the best way for me to describe an issue like that, where some engines just won't have a telltale on the hose. Just put them in the water, boom, they got a great telltale and everything is running great. But that's kind of like that conversation. You can wait a little bit longer, but if it has a problem, you might as well just grab yourself a trash can or a bucket, depending on how big your engine is, and stick it on there to run it. Sheldon Baton says, I am changing out my gear oil on my 15 horsepower 4-stroke, and the gear oil is white, not milky, it is white. Is this a special lube, and can I just change over to the regular oil? If you have white gear, I don't know. Someone tell me, is there a white gear lube out there? I've never seen a white gear lube. So, if you know of a brand that has white gear lube, let me know what that is, because I've never heard of that. So I would say that you got a water problem and you need to pressure test that gear case. It may not be milky per se, but when people say milky, I think a lot of them are not really saying you're saying that it's white, basically. When you say milky, you're saying white. Usually someone says milky, it's either white or it's green, or you can see traces of a white trail or stuff like that. But if you've got like white, then I'm not sure what that is. I would definitely be pressure testing the gear case and then, filling it up with regular old gear oil. So let me know. I've never seen a straight white gear lube, so maybe there is something out there that I don't know about, which is very possible. James Rumsey says, what washdown pumps do you like the best? I like the Jabsco washdown pumps, but the problem with them is they are stupid expensive. And some of the cheaper stuff out there is just as good as a washdown pump. I mean, a washdown pump is a washdown pump. So depending on how hard it is to get to it and the fittings. So the two big things about the washdown pump is the fittings that it goes to, because some of them, the hoses come out, boom, they're right here, and here's your pump, and like there's no wiggle room. You have to replace it with the same exact pump, or else your hoses might be too short. You might have to cut the hoses. You might not have the same type of fittings that go on there. Jabsco, a lot of them I like. There's a lot of pumps out there that have the screw-on fittings, so that makes it very nice because you just screw them on and then boom, it's done. You can change it out really quick and easy. But as far as like the brand, I mean, I like the Jabscos. Depends on what it's being used for. I've used the C-Flows. They're all right. I think they fail. It all depends on what you're using it for. So there's a lot of Amazon cheap washdown pumps out there that will last just as long as the Jabsco. So I can't really, technically better than the other, but I'm just used to using the Jabsco, so I like them. Lil Dina says, how would you get one of the filler hoses out of the foam? I have the exact same situation as yours on my Scout 175. So we're talking about the fuel tank filler hoses and vent hoses that go from the side of the boat down through foam, down the side of the gunnel, under the deck, over to the fuel tank compartment, goes through or under the stringer to your fuel tank. Massive nightmare. I started digging mine out and gave up since it wasn't the source of the leak. My tank was leaking and I replaced everything except the filler hose. I'm thinking keep digging or maybe couple another hose to it and yank. So yes, this is by far, I can't say that because replacing a fuel tank is a massive endeavor, and depending on, the boat and what you got going on is going to depend on whether or not, how bad this is. If you got to cut your deck out, that's the worst part of doing the fuel tank. But changing out the filler hose and the vent hose is a massive nightmare on most of them, because the hoses, the vent hose, not so much. The vent hose is just regular hose. It's just rubber. It bends. The fuel tank filler hose is a wire enforced. It's a solid hose. They don't bend that easy. They do bend, but not that easy. And especially after it has been in a boat for, let's say, 20, 30 years. 20, 30 years, the hose is going to have a 90-degree kink in it from going over and up, and they do not like to bend. They are a massive pain in the neck. And yes, if it runs down the gunnel, under the deck, over to the fuel tank, and that is all foamed in, even more of a nightmare, because now the foam has got it stuck there, and it's like, getting it out, it's straight up digging, getting long pry bars, sticking them in through the access port and digging out as much of that foam as you can. And then the big problem is depending on the stringer situation, because once it gets down to the down the gunnel, it's got to go under the deck, and then it's got to go through the stringer or on top of the stringer. And then depending on how the boat was built, like, a lot of boats are built, the hull's built, the deck, and then the deck and the cap are put down on top of that hull. So it's like the fuel tank goes in there, the hose was in there, and then the deck and the cap got put down on top of it. And there ain't, there's no access to that thing. So depending on how bad it is, hooking another filler hose to it and then yanking that thing out through the top, it is a massive pain. Worst case scenario, you got to take the console out of the boat, cut a hole in like you've got your access port here on the gunnel, straight down, straight over, underneath the console. You would cut another access there so you can get your hand in there, dig out more foam, and then be able to push the hose while yanking on it. So it's kind of like a two-person job where you attach the two and then push and yank, push and yank, push and yank. Yeah, complete nightmare. Totally sucks. Definitely the trick is to hook it up, coupler it, but also get wire glide, put some wire glide on there. Klein wire glide, you can get at Home Depot, Lowe's. It's like a lubricant for wire. Put that on there, and then also two people. Having one person yank and the other pushing on the hose, that's the ticket. Matt says, what if you have a fuel smell on a boat similar to one you're working on now? Well, you got to figure out where that fuel smell is coming from, bro. Like, if you got fuel smell in your boat, you need to figure that out. It is a massive problem. You can't be, one, if your fuel tank's leaking, it's getting in your bilge. It's going to run your bilge pump, your float switch, and all the stuff down there. So you're going to have to replace all that stuff if you let it prolong. And then two, now all of a sudden you've got fuel exposed. So any kind of a spark, any kind of flame, any kind of like, you're on a bomb now. You know what I'm saying? Like when you got fuel in a fuel tank, it's enclosed, it's vented to the outside of the boat. So it's, you know, people lighting cigarettes, doing all that stuff, not a big problem. But as soon as you get fuel in the boat, now all of a sudden you got the fumes of the fuel. That's what's ignitable. So you do not want that. You need to figure out where the leak is and fix the leak. So whether that is a bad tank, a leaking pickup, a leaking fill hose, a leaking fuel sender, a broken hose, a rusty fuel water separator that is leaking, a leaking water separator bracket, primer bulb, whatever. I mean, you just got to trace it down, which can be a pain, but you need to figure that out. It's not good to be having a leaking fuel in your boat. Okay, Yamaha Outboard guy says, great video. I have a 1988 Yamaha 30 horsepower two-stroke outboard that skips/jumps when above 1200 RPM in forward gear. Reverse and neutral work as they should. I disassembled it and the dog clutch and gears look fine. Any ideas what could be going on? I tried adjusting the shift linkage and it made no difference. If you think about what's going on here, if you've got an engine, so take your gear case, right? Here's your gear case. Reverse gear, forward gear, clutch dog in the middle. The clutch dog engages the forward gear, which means that it is all the way forward. And if it's all the way forward, then it usually, once you get above 1200 RPMs, usually the force of the propeller in going through the water and the force of the two gears lock together at, let's say your gear ratio is a 2-to-1. That means that those gears are spinning 1200 RPM on the engine, 600 RPM your gears, because of 2-to-1 gear reduction based on, you know, how big your crank is and your pinion gear. So like gear reduction, think your pinion gear has 15 teeth on it, forward gear has 30 teeth on it, 2-to-1 gear ratio, or gear reduction, I guess you'd say. So for every 2 times that the crank spins, that gear spins once. 1200 RPM, 600 RPM on the gear. So at 1200 RPM, that gear at 600 times per minute is usually enough force for it to stay locked into place. Now, on a 30 horsepower two-stroke Yamaha 1988, I really don't know if this is how the gear cases exactly were back then, but by and large, most of their gear cases have been pretty identical for the past 40 years. It's a very solid design. They're very basic, I guess you would say. Most likely, can't say this 100%, but most likely the way that gear case functions is that there's a pin that goes into the prop shaft. There is a spring behind that pin, and that spring pushes that thing forward, which pushes the clutch dog forward. The clutch dog is always trying to be in the forward position, and in the front of that prop shaft, you're going to have a little thing like this, which is your shift shaft. So when you shift it in forward, it pulls it up, which lets that spring push that gear to the forward position. As you push it to neutral, this shift shaft comes down, which pushes this back, which puts it into neutral, down, reverse. So there's like that spring action there. If your spring is broken and it's not keeping that gear into forward, that could be a potential problem. Most likely not. I just went through that whole discussion for really no reason because I highly doubt that's the problem. It could be, but most likely it's not. Most likely it is in the shifting mechanism, and the shifting mechanism is, for whatever reason, not holding it into position, and it's loose or whatever, something's broke that's letting it pop back into neutral. And once you rev up to 1200 RPM, it's just got enough force that just throws it out for whatever reason, which generally is not the case because the gears, most of them are slanted. So like there's a slant. So when it gets in, it locks in. So that's why you can't ever just slam shift out of gear. You need to bring it back to neutral detent when you're going from forward or reverse into neutral. You bring that to your detent position on the control box, which then lets the RPM go down to neutral, or not neutral, but to idle. Once you're at idle, the engine's running at 800, 700, 600 RPM, which means that gear is only spinning at 300, 400 RPM. So going from neutral or forward detent to neutral with that slow spinning, it's easy to pop out. But if you're at 1200 RPM and you try and slam out, those slants on the gears keep them locked into place, which makes it hard to shift. So I would be looking at the shift mechanism, not necessarily the lower unit, but there is a potential that that lower unit, something there is not correct. Maybe that spring's messed up or something like that, but it's a 90% not going to be that. It's just very unlikely because it's a pretty mechanically sound system. Chuga says, man, that's a lot of work. I was wondering if I were the owner of a damaged lower unit, would I buy a used one with some sort of warranty, or should I retrofit, build it, looking how much time and effort it takes? I would imagine that labor would be to the roof. I don't know. Totally depends on what lower unit you have and also who is rebuilding it. So for one, if you've got, let's say you've got like Chuga, or not Chuga, but the Outboard guy. If you've got a 30 horsepower Yamaha 1988 two-stroke lower unit, you could get a good used lower unit for $400. Now, if you want to rebuild that, like let's say you've got, a gear failed or something like that, a bearing failed, the case is still good, and you want to take the time to disassemble it, buy a new bearing, buy a new gear, buy a new race. Usually they come as a set. And let's say that is a couple $100. Then you buy a shim set, that's another $50. Then you buy, the gear, and all of a sudden, just in parts, you're more than what a used good gear case is going to cost. And you've got to take all the time to do it. And let's say you don't do it properly and you blow the gear case up. You just wasted all that money. But also at the same time, how much is a 30 horsepower new lower unit? Maybe $1,000. I mean, I don't know. I mean, the smaller gear cases, they're not as expensive as if you got a 300. If you got a 300, you're talking about a $6,000-$7,000 gear case. Okay, now we can have the discussion on rebuilding it. But also, depending on the shop, like if you find somewhere that rebuilds gear cases, I don't think there are as many out there as there used to be. It's kind of like a dying art, I guess you would say, is there's not near as many shops out there rebuilding gear cases as there used to be. People aren't doing it anymore. They just buy new ones, and then also aftermarket OBR, SEI, that kind of stuff. You can get an aftermarket lower unit for say $3,500 and comes with a 3-year warranty. So it's kind of like by the time you pay a shop to buy all the gears and the shim set and all that stuff, and then spend 8 hours rebuilding it, depending on how bad your gear case is. Like if you're in saltwater, getting that gear case apart, you're drilling out the gland nut, you're heating up the gear case, your pinion gear is welded itself onto the drive shaft, you got the vice grips on there, hammer that off. Like, you've got a lot of stuff going on here to get all this stuff out. Then you got to buy a seal kit. Then you got to buy the races, the bearings, all that. Like it can get pretty expensive and timely to do it. Granted, if you find a good shop that rebuilds them more regularly, they're going to have everything set up. You know what I'm saying? Like they've got all their shims out. They've got all their parts there. Everything's like right there, and they can do it in a quicker manner, which saves you on the time aspect. But realistically, it's almost... You definitely have to do your research. If there's no place around you that rebuilds gear cases, and boxing up your gear case, mailing it to a shop to rebuild, and then them mailing it back and paying them to do it, by that time, the time that it takes for you to do all that, the time it takes them to do it, the time in the shipping and all that other stuff and all the parts, generally it doesn't outweigh it. When you can go and buy a rebuilt gear case, or you can buy an aftermarket gear case, or you can buy a used gear case, and kind of like the time and the money, it almost equals out, or is way more beneficial to buy, remove, and replace than have rebuilt. Again, every situation's totally different. If you've got, depending on the situation, in some instances, the rebuild is going to be worth it over buying new, but that's something that, again, totally situational. But at least now that gets you thinking about, what exactly the thought process is there, and which one's going to weigh in your benefit depending on your situation. Next question is, why do people hate two-strokes? I mean, I don't really think that... Okay, so yeah, there's definitely, you got two different groups here. You got the two-stroke mafia, which are people that are going to die on the hill of a two-stroke, and that's just what it is. And then you've got the people that hate them. So most usually the two-stroke mafia, they usually work on their own stuff. A lot of them, they like the power because you've got more power out of a 2-stroke than you do out of a 4-stroke, just simply because of the physics of it. I mean, it's less strokes, it's more power, it's more instant. And then also they're a lot easier to work on. People can the service is cheaper, and there's a lot of benefits to a 2-stroke. They hate gas. Like if you got bad gas, dirty gas, ethanol, any of that stuff, very hard on a 2-stroke depending on how you use it. And then also storage can be a problem if you got ethanol fuel or poor fuel and you feed that to the 2-stroke. It can cause you problems. But with a 2-stroke, taking apart a carburetor, cleaning it, rebuilding it, putting it back together, very simple. Most people can still do that. And if you can do that, then there you go. That's why they're going to love the 2-stroke, because it doesn't stop them when it breaks. A lot of people like that, if you have a 4-stroke and you don't know that much about them, then they can be more difficult and you're not as comfortable with it. So like, whereas if something goes wrong with the 2-stroke, you know everything about it and you can fix it and be up and running back on the lake the next day, opposed to this one. If the 4-stroke goes down, you don't know much about it. You don't have the sensors, the computers, all that other stuff, which once you do a lot of them, I think 4-stroke is just as easy to work on as 2-stroke. So, it's totally a familiarity thing. Like, how familiar are you with the product? But that's the 2-stroke mafia. Then the other people that completely hate 2-strokes are usually people where I don't even think it really matters that it was a 2-stroke. And these are going to be branded people as well. So especially in boating, if you have a very bad experience, this is why so many people hate Evinrude. This is why so many people hate certain Yamahas and certain Mercuries. I mean, you could name the brand. There are people that hate other brands. Ford, Chevy, Dodge, there's increments where people hate the other one for whatever reason. And generally, it's been my experience that most of the time, those that are in the hate camp have had a horrible experience. So somebody that bought a 3.3 Yamaha HPDI and the thing was always broken. They blew up power heads. They had constant problems. It drained them of thousands and thousands of dollars. They hate Yamahas. They hate 2-strokes. They do not want anything to do with it, and that is why they don't like them. Same thing for OptiMaxes. The first OptiPops that came out, people that paid thousands and thousands of dollars to get the brand new OptiMax, and the thing kept blowing up. It cost them thousands of dollars. They were always missing time on the water in seasons, and their season is, say, a 3-month season, and they basically didn't get to do any boating, any fishing for 2 months of the 3-month season because this 2-stroke blew up the whole time. They hate Mercury and they hate 2-strokes. That's ingrained in them and will be ingrained in them. Same thing for everybody that got burned on a Ficht, and everybody that got burned on a Force, everybody that got burned on, name your brand and model. Those people that got terrible experience, pretty much why a lot of people hate Evinrude is because Evinrude was always a 50-50 brand, in my opinion, because they had people like me. I had a 1990, I can't remember the exact year, but I had a 250 Ocean Runner, Evinrude Ocean Runner. That thing ran 3 seasons, flawless, used it 2-3 times a week, no problems whatsoever. The plastic carburetors, I got rid of the oil system, pre-mixed it, and ran everywhere in that boat, no issues. Then you have other people that have the same thing, same Ocean Runner, and they had nothing but problems. The plastic carburetors, the warping, the oiling problems, the blue power heads, like all kinds of issues. We both had the same engines, but some of us, 50% of us, had an excellent experience and had no issues. The other 50% just had nothing but problems and constantly losing money and then got burned. And then you got the new era, I guess you would say, of Evinrude, where people bought all these, the brand new stuff, and then they shut down the business and you can't get warranty, you can't get products, you got, a whole different ordeal. Like those people are now burned on 2-strokes and they're burned on those brands. So I don't know if I would say that it's because people hate 2-strokes. It's more that they hate the experience that they had with the 2-stroke, because there's nothing inherently wrong with a 2-stroke. Like I said, there's so many benefits with the power and the power to weight ratios and the instant power, like the cheap maintenance maintenance, like the ease of working on them. Like, it's not a bad engine. It is just that some people, especially now, people that have a 20, 25, 30-year-old two-stroke that has been used in saltwater. I always use saltwater because that's my experience. I don't know that much about you guys that live up north, that you live in Wisconsin, Michigan, Ohio, all these places where you've got fresh water, all your stuff comes apart, everything's easy. You got 40-year-old engines that look like they're brand new. Like I don't have that. I get the salty, the busted, the 10 years, completely crusted, falling apart type of stuff where you have to heat it up to get it apart. Like, I'm dealing with that kind of stuff. So when I look at something, people here, you have a 15, 20-year-old engine. It just happens to be a two-stroke, but it's been used in saltwater. It has not been well maintained, and every time you use the boat, it's a problem. Something breaks. The CDI box goes bad. The ignition coils go bad. Your stator goes bad. The rectifier regulator goes bad. The ignition coils fail. You're always fouling plugs because it's over-rich. The carburetor is always getting gummed up. The wires are melting. Your timer base is melted, and the magnets fall off the flywheel, and like all these things that happen with an engine that gets used constantly all year round in saltwater, not maintained, and is in the heat, the 100-degree weather, the sun, the 90-degree saltwater. Like, the engines, like, it just takes that abuse. And so people have that experience. So they equate that with a two-stroke. Not necessarily that it's the two-stroke. It's just that two-stroke that they had gave them all those problems, and then they bought a F-150 Yamaha, or they got, a 150 Merc, or they got a Suzuki 140, 175, 250, like it doesn't matter. They got that four-stroke, and it's quiet, it's fuel efficient, it is, full of power, and it gives them no problems. They have all the stuff on the dash. They can see all the stuff. So it's like the two experiences are completely different, because this one is nothing but good and this one was nothing but horrible. So they hate two-strokes because of that. And so I think, in my opinion, that's kind of like the answer to the question of why do people hate two-strokes. It's because of their experience, not necessarily because of the engine. It's because of their experience with a specific engine, because you can take someone else that knows what they're doing with a 92 stroke and have no problems with it. Yeah, granted, just like any outboard, you're going to have an issue. You run aground, you scratch up the skeg, you have a leak in your lower unit because the prop, you got fishing line around the prop shaft and it cut into the prop shaft seal and now it's leaking. All those things, you got a batch of bad gas and it gummed up your injectors or gummed up your carburetor. You got a clean carburetor. Like, all those things go into just natural boating in general. So that's my answer to that. Moving on to Gavin Matthews. I have a lot of bubbles coming from the lower unit and has never happened before. I have a 2011 Evinrude 40 horsepower E-Tech. Could this also be a thermostat? It could be the thermostat for sure. Generally, so it really depends. I mean, bubbles coming out the prop, that is totally normal. Your exhaust comes out of the propeller. Basically, every engine has two exhaust ports on it for the most part. Outboards. We're talking about outboards. They have an above the water exhaust, and you have the exhaust that comes out from the propeller. So when the boat is sitting at idle, the back pressure of the water surrounding the lower unit and the engine is too much for the engine's exhaust to be able to go out the propeller, so it has an above the water exhaust where it just dumps that stuff out. Usually, if you have like a thermostat failure or something like that, it can cause the water, the way the thermostat is routed, depending on the engine model, that can start squirting water out the back of that above the water exhaust. So if that thermostat sticks or whatever, you have a clog somewhere, and that water is now just getting shot out, of the above the water exhaust, opposed to being dumped down to the prop into your regular exhaust housing, that's like a sign there, which is, I think, is what you're talking about here. But the bubbles coming out from there, it could be related to the thermostat, but at the same time, it might not be. I mean, you could have a slew of different problems on why you're having more air bubbles coming out from one engine than that you didn't normally see before. That could be like a range of stuff. Like, you could have a problem with your exhaust housing. You could have a problem with a gasket within that exhaust system. You could have a problem where, let's say, a mud dauber or something that above the water exhaust that we're talking about. Let's say a mud dauber got up in there and built a little nest, and now that's blocked. So now the above the water exhaust, when you're sitting there idling, the air can't get out from that exhaust because it's clogged. So now it's being pushed out through the propeller, which is why you have more bubbles. So that could be something. You could have a bad ignition coil, bad spark plug, like a running problem with the engine, which is making your timing and everything else get all messed up, which is creating more. It's creating more bubbles. I mean, it's not like the engine's creating air and you're not, it's just the way your mixture of fuel to air ratio is being burned, and it's not being burned properly. You've got, kind of a problem there. So like your issue, it's not that the engine is taking in a certain amount of air and putting out more air. It can't make air, but it's just the running issue within that, whether that be an ignition coil or whatever that's throwing stuff off, that can create a running issue that will result in more bubbles and coming out the exhaust. Probably not as common as like the dirt dauber situation, but yeah, it could be a lot of different things. Reef Slayer says, let's say I am using an ACR and want to get a lithium battery for the house. Would I put the DC to DC charger between my relay and the house battery? I'm running a 200 HPDI with an Optima blue top for the starter. So realistically, you don't need an ACR. So just to add a lithium for your house battery, you don't really need the ACR, because the DC to DC charger kind of works like that depending on which one you buy. So normally, okay, I'm going to try and paint this picture for you without a graphic. So the alternator or your outboard, the stator, the alternator, the outboard. Think about that. That is the source of power, creating power and then feeding it to your battery. So here's your engine creating power. It's feeding it to the battery. Here's your blue top. Here's your Optima. Here's your starting battery. Boom. That's connected to the outboard, and that's what starts your outboard. Outboard here, connected, boom, starts it. Now, a lot of these DC to DC chargers, what they do is they will connect through the start battery or through this line. So the wire going from this battery to here can be attached to, mainly just for the battery, to a fuse that is going to then go to your DC to DC charger. So it's almost like it's stealing charge power. I mean, let's just say that. Let's say that it's taking charge power from here through the DC to DC charger and then out that to your lithium battery. So your star battery stays in line. The engine charges the star battery. The star battery also has power that is getting pulled from here to the DC to DC. It's using that charge power and then sending it to the lithium. That's kind of the way, I guess the best way that I could describe it, depending on the system. But no, you wouldn't need an ACR, because an ACR is an automatic charge relay that just senses and distributes. So it's like it blocks opposed to sharing. Yeah, sharing. Let's say that. Let's say that the DC to DC charger is sharing charge voltage, whereas your ACR is selecting who gets the charge voltage. So ACR, your charge power comes from the engine to the ACR. From the ACR is connected to this battery and to this battery. And depending on which battery is lower, the ACR decides to send that charge voltage to that battery. Once that battery comes up, then it moves over and charges the other battery. And there's different variations of ACRs that work in other ways, but in general, an isolator, a charge relay, a voltage sensing relay, like that's in general how those work. So it's almost like the DC to DC is acting as that. Mark McLinden, motor temp has to reach 143 degrees before the telltale will pee. No, generally, as long as you don't have any issues, and depending on the impeller condition, your thermostat, stuff like that, the poppet valve, depending on your engine and the system, usually when you turn the engine on, that impeller, like we had been talking about, is primed. It's under the water. It starts pushing water up there. Doesn't generally take that long for it to fill the power head and then to be running out the telltale. So within the first few seconds of the engine running, it should have a telltale. The thermostat only opens up to regulate the engine temperature using that water, where it diverts it and dumps it out the exhaust to cool the engine and maintain a 143-degree temperature. So that temperature has nothing to do with the telltale. The telltale generally comes off of something else. It's usually just, you know, a fitting, whether that be on the block, on the water jacket, running through a rectifier rate. Like it's coming from somewhere and then just going out. Has nothing to do with the thermostat. The thermostat only just dumps water. That answers the question. Francis Callahan says, do you have to install brakes on both axles, or can you get away with brakes on just one axle? I read your question wrong. Okay, here's what I first thought. I thought you said, can you put brakes on one side and not on the other, basically. Like if you put, you know, here's your trailer, you know, you got your trailer, and here's the axle. Let's say we're going to talk about tandem axle trailer. So you got two axles on the trailer, and I thought you were asking, can you put brakes on one side and not the other? And that is like, no, don't do that. Because when you think about that, if you were to do that, like if you've got, you know, here's your two wheels on your trailer, right? And it goes up, hooks to your truck, and there's your truck. So if you've got your two axles and you put brakes on this side, when you brake, these tires, let's say they lock up, you know, they slow down, they lock up. These do not. So that's going to turn your trailer like this. The pivot point on the trailer to the tongue to your truck is not going to be going like this, which is going to throw your truck like that. And it's like, you know, it's going to be an accident. Like you're going to have a problem. So that's what I thought you said, but no. Okay. So do you install brakes on one axle and not the other? Like, let's say you got a tandem trailer, you know, I think you're saying, you know, one axle, two axles. Yes, you can do one axle. There are certain places or states that, you know, trailering is kind of weird, because there are certain states that have weird rules about trailering and trailer brakes and the tonnage, and like, you know, depending on, you know, the weight of the trailer, the axles of the trailer, and all this other stuff, it determines how many brakes you need per axle. And some, you can't have brakes on one axle and not the other. So like that is like, there is, I believe, some legal things there that depends on where you live and the place. But as far as functionality goes, if your boat isn't that heavy, you have a tandem axle trailer, it's 2,500 pound boat, and, you know, brakes on one axle is going to be fine. You're towing it with an F350, you know, like totally situational realistically when it comes to the functionality of it. Like if you're towing a 2,500 pound boat on a tandem axle trailer with trailer brakes on one axle behind an F350, like there's no problem here. Like, you know, like you could probably not even have trailer brakes on it with that truck. So Darren says, your videos are great and very educational. Thank you, Darren. I have a question if you could help. My boat has a Suzuki DF90A. The starting battery was a 24 Group 24 550 cold cranking amps, 675 cranking amps. I run two live wells off it as well, and they drained it the last time out to the point where my jump box didn't even start the motor. It was an old battery though. Can I increase the battery size to an 800 cold cranking amps, 1,000 cranking amps to help the live well operation, or will this affect the motor's charging ability? Thanks for any help. No, definitely 100%. Put that 800 in there, a Group 27 or something like that. It's not necessarily going to affect the charging. The engine's going to charge what the engine's going to charge. That 90, I don't know what the Suzuki DF90 charge output is. Maybe it's like, I don't know, 35, 65, somewhere in that area is what your charging amps are going to be. From a 550 to an 800, it's not really going to affect the engine that much. Your engine's going to be able to charge that. Now, as far as the draining though, for one, you should probably use a dual purpose battery, because if you're using, if you have a single battery for your start and your house, then you don't want to have just a start battery in there. You're going to want to have a dual purpose, meaning your start and your deep cycle. So the best way to describe this, just so you have a better understanding of what's going on here, is that I'm going to put this in a simple way. So, you know, all the technical stuff, it goes beyond this, but this is very simple. Let's look at it like this. A starting battery, each battery has cells in the battery. A starting battery has really thin cells in the battery because it produces power and then it instantly charges up. So the battery never really gets below, let's say, 95% charge. As soon as it puts out that amperage for the engine to start, the engine starts charging it. So it goes from 100% to 95% back to 100%. It has thin plates in the battery. That's generally how a starting battery works. A deep cycle battery has big cells in it, so they're much thicker. So it can drain down. It can drain down to, say, 40% and then get charged back up to 100%. So the deep cycle is more for your house stuff, because if you're sitting there using the radio, your live wells, and your bottom finder, your fish finder, your chart plotter, whatever you're using, the power is being consumed, but the battery's not getting charged until you start the engine, and that charges it back up. So those thicker plates allow you to be able to use power for, let's say, an hour, which that drops it down to 90% charge. I'm making these numbers up, but you get the gist of what I'm saying here. The battery goes from 100% charged to 80% charged, and that's because you are using X amount of electronics over a 2-hour period. If that's the way your system is, where you have one battery with one engine, then you should get a dual purpose battery, because it's designed for that. It's a start battery and a deep cycle battery. It's a dual purpose, okay? Depending on how much you're using, let's say you bottom fish a lot and you're using your live well the whole time. So let's say you're at a spot for 3 hours, whatever. Depending on how long you're there, if you're using your sonar and your fish finder, you've got 2 live well pumps running, and let's say your radio is running. If you're consuming power like that, it might even be more advantageous to you at the same time, not only to get the 800 cold cranking amp battery, dual purpose battery, but also to every 45 minutes start and run your engine for 15, 20 minutes or whatever, just to help maintain that battery. So again, this all depends on how much power you're using, but you get the idea here is that if you're sitting there using power on your boat for an extended period of time, it can help to just start the engine every now and then, let it idle for 15, 20, 30 minutes, which is going to charge up your battery. Granted, most boats, most power consumption, you'll be able to go out there on a dual purpose battery and run your 2 live well pumps and your sonar for 4 hours, and your engine's going to start right back up. Me personally, I'm not that brave. If I go offshore, I generally like 2 batteries, where I have a start battery and a house battery, because if anything happens, you need to be able to start that engine. Like you want to be able to start that engine. So having a battery switch that you can select to one and be consuming all your power from the house battery, but be able to move that over to your start battery, start your engine, and then move it back and charge that battery back up, you will not get stranded. If you have one battery and one engine and you consume power for 4 hours and it doesn't have enough power to now start your engine, you're stranded. You need your jump pack. So generally I like to have 2 batteries on the boat, but again, depending on your situation, put the 800 in there, no problem. But also think about that. If you're consuming power like that, you might just want to every now and then start the engine and charge it up a little.